Good morning from WKYT News. I'm Bill Bryant, and we certainly hope you're enjoying your weekend. This weekend marked 10 years since the crash of Flight 5191 at Bluegrass Airport in Lexington. On August 27, 2006, just as dawn was breaking, the Comair flight took off from a runway that was too short for the commuter jet to get airborne. 49 of the 50 people on board were killed. Later in this broadcast, Lexington's mayor at the time, Teresa Isaac, will join us and talk about what it was like to lead the city through the sorrow and the tears, and her perspective now on how loved ones and local leaders have carried on. But first, Deborah Hersman is a former member of the U.S. National Transportation Safety Board who came to Lexington right after the crash. She is now president and CEO of the National Safety Council in Chicago, where she deals with lots of transportation issues nationwide. And Deborah's joining us from the Safety Council's headquarters in Chicago for Kentucky Newsmakers. Thank you so much for speaking with us. We appreciate it.
It's great to be with you.
When you think back to the 5191 crash at Bluegrass Airport, and of course it is fresh on all of our minds around here certainly, and the time you spent in Lexington after the crash, what comes to mind?
You know, the most abiding memory, I think, of that crash is really the sense of community. I think the sense of community that everyone felt, and even people who weren't part of the community who came in to collect their loved ones' remains, the investigators who came to the scene, all of the coroners who came from around the state to help. Lexington just opened their arms to every single one of us and took us in and treated us like family.
And certainly at that time you were here to do business, to begin the investigation, and to assure the people who were here that that investigation would be done and it would be extensive and that you would get answers. But at the same time, obviously, you couldn't help but notice, as you said, that that support that the community was giving people, the outpouring from within Lexington and across Kentucky.
That's right, and I think another piece of it was spending time with the families who had lost loved ones, was really being able to be witness to incredible grace during probably the hardest, most difficult time in people's lives. They still were reaching out to comfort each other.
So as you think back to the investigation, how extensive was it? I know it took a considerable time for all of the answers to be gotten. Do you feel that the crash was fully investigated and that we learned all we could from that investigation?
You know, I would say that's one thing that's a hallmark of NTSB investigations, is that they're very thorough. And so they do take time because they want to gather all of the information. They want to interview everyone who's involved. They want to leave no stone unturned. And so they looked at the environment at the airport and opportunities to improve not just Bluegrass Airport, but airports nationwide. So this would never happen again to another crew and another airplane full of passengers. And so changes were made when it came to runway markings and lighting. We also looked at the human beings that were involved. We know that humans make mistakes, we make errors, and so how do we protect and guard against those errors before they turn into something tragic? The NTSB made recommendations about processes and procedures in the cockpit, and also looked at air traffic control, and then they looked at the equipment in the aircraft and how we could identify technology to help us so that these kinds of things wouldn't happen again. And so all of those recommendations that came out of Lexington, I have no doubt that aviation is safer, that there were lessons learned, and that lives were saved because of the work that was done and the things that were learned from that tragic event in Bluegrass Airport.
Would you say it is fair to conclude that there were, as you point out, multiple factors involved in the crash of 5191, and that oftentimes when there is an aviation issue in this country, there are multiple factors involved?
We know that whenever there's an event like this that occurs, that it's never one thing. We can't oversimplify things that occur particularly major transportation events, but it's things that occur in all of our lives. There's multiple factors, and we think about them as really the lines or the holes lining up in Swiss cheese, where everything has to line up for you to really pass through all of those protections and those safety gates. Or think of it like a chain, and the chain is only as strong as its weakest link, and so you really have to make sure each link is strong, not just one piece of the puzzle, but all of it has to fit together to make a safe system. The good news is that we go for years in this country. Since the Comair crash, we have years where we have 0 fatalities in commercial aviation with millions of enplanements, and that's because that system does work almost perfectly every time. But the thing for those 49 that were lost 10 years ago, and all of the family and the friends and the community that was affected, this crash could have been prevented. This crash was tragic, but so many things have come out of it, and I keep going back to the community and to the people who were involved. All of the events that have occurred since the crash. I was back for the 1-year anniversary, for the 5-year, and I'm so grateful to be included in the 10-year anniversary this weekend. But there are so many amazing people, and they have taken from this tragedy so much goodness, and they have passed it on and they've paid it forward. And that's really a testament to the people that were lost and those that they loved, that they were able to make so many good things come out of this terrible event.
Well, I know that people are very appreciative of your hard work and those many hours that you put in, and certainly those comforting words that you gave after the crash, and that certainly that over these years that you have stayed in touch with people here. I know, Deborah, that you moved on to other responsibilities, but have you been able to follow up and feel confident that most of what was recommended by the NTSB and others after 5191 have been followed up, and those improvements have been made?
Many of the recommendations were actually implemented within months, years of the crash, but there are some that were not implemented. The NTSB did close out a recommendation as unacceptable that asked for the FAA to require things like what we would call moving maps in the cockpit or audible alerts. These are things that most of us can actually take advantage of on our phones when we're on the road. And so 10 years ago, moving maps might have seemed like something that was high technology. But today, we have moving maps that tell us where the nearest coffee shop is or how to get to a basketball game. And so we know that this technology is out there, and I think that's one area where the NTSB was certainly disappointed that the FAA didn't move on that recommendation, move faster, and require its adoption in all aircraft that transport passengers. We really want to take advantage of technology when we can to have that life-saving benefit.
Do you feel that going forward those things will be done, that that technology will be embraced, and that air travel will be even safer?
We know that that technology is going to be embraced. It's the way of the world. We make progress, we move forward, we advance. As things change, we all get safer. But we also have to recognize there's unintended consequences that come along with technology too. We want to make sure that that technology is effective and that it doesn't result in confusion or distraction. And so I would say those are always challenges. We've certainly seen in aviation an over-reliance on automation that's come as everything in the cockpit. There's a lot of autopilot. There's a lot of systems that pilots really are monitoring rather than actually manually flying or adjusting themselves. And so there are two sides to every coin. Increased automation and technology can be a game changer and can solve a lot of problems and address a lot of mistakes that each of us make as human beings. But there's also a risk when it comes to automation. It's got to work every time. People have to understand what the failure modes are, and they can't get over-reliant on it, particularly if it's in a situation that might be unfamiliar to them.
You still want to do those walk-arounds, right? Deborah, you're now the president and the CEO of the National Safety Council, and in that capacity, you look at a wide range of transportation issues in the country. What kinds of things are you looking to improve as people travel, whether it's on the road or by other means of travel?
You know, one of the biggest areas that we can make improvements in this country is when it comes to highway safety. We killed 38,000 people last year. We had an 8% increase in highway fatalities. For the first 6 months of this year, we're seeing a 9% increase over the last year's first 6 months. And Kentucky is actually one of those states that really is a top gainer when it comes to increased fatalities. And so when we look at the fatality numbers, the sheer numbers, we lose 100 people every day on our roadways. Those deaths are completely preventable. That's like having 2 com-airs occur every day. And so as a society, we've become very complacent about those deaths that occur on our roadways. We have got to address this issue. 10,000 people are killed every year in alcohol-impaired crashes. 50% of the people who are killed on our roadways don't wear their seatbelts. There are so many things that we can do to drive that fatality count down. We just have to identify the means to do it. We have to take responsibility ourselves as individuals, but we also need to look to our policymakers and legislators to put those provisions in place that will result in more lives saved.
Well, very good work that you're involved in now, no doubt, there at the National Safety Council. And we want to thank Deborah Hersman for taking time out. And I know that people here thank you for your thoroughness in the investigation of 5191, your grace under pressure when you came here in those days and weeks after the crash, and certainly your kindness to the people here through the years. Thank you very much for being with us. And we'll be back on WKYT's Kentucky Newsmakers in just a moment with Lexington's former Mayor Teresa Isaac, who was the mayor of the city at the time of the crash. Welcome back to WKYT's Kentucky Newsmakers. In our interview with Deborah Hersman from the NTSB, she talked about how caring the Lexington community was in the wake of the 5191 crash at Bluegrass Airport that was 10 years ago this weekend. It was a time of profound loss for the community, and yet in many ways ties were strengthened during the search for answers about the crash, and the Bluegrass found ways to remember those who died. Leading the Lexington-Fayette Urban County government at the time was then Mayor Teresa Isaac, and she's joining us on this 10th anniversary of the crash to talk about the tragedy and what it was like to be in her position. Mayor Isaac, thanks for coming. Appreciate it very much.
Thank you for having me.
Do you remember how you heard about the crash?
It was very early that morning, right after it happened, and I got a call from the 911 center and drove straight in and was at the police station at the 911 center. And then when I realized how bad it was, then I was directly at the site.
How did you know how bad it was?
From the calls that were coming in from police and fire.
And you, when you were hearing that, what was going through your mind, knowing that whatever happened, you would be a large part in leading the government's response?
It was going through my mind that it sounded very bad and that there may not be any survivors, and I wanted to make sure that we took care of the families, got them to a secure location, and that I was actually on site to make sure that their family members were handled with dignity and respect as they were moved to the medical examiner's office.
As a result, you did not appear at the initial news conferences, and there were those who thought you might have actually been on the flight because you were going to Germany.
I was scheduled to go, and then I'd canceled the trip, but I had been scheduled, but not on that flight, a later flight.
That was to prepare for the 2010 World Equestrian Games, and you ended up changing your plans and not going at all.
And I didn't go, right.
So as you moved from recognizing how serious it was and going out there to the site, where do you go from there?
Well, we made sure that we had the families secure. We had police officers that were assigned to protect the families and to get them to a secure location so that they could receive communication from the airline and from counselors that we were making available. And then we wanted to make sure that we were giving the families updates. We wanted to make sure they had as much information as they could get. And then we worked with state authorities to make sure we could have extra help to both transport and perform autopsies on family members.
And then it's a human response.
Yes.
When you
Yes.
saw those families initially,
Yes.
all you can do is give them a hug.
Give them hugs and try to give them as much information. We wanted to make sure we could help identify people as quickly as possible so they could be returned to their loved ones. And so we worked very closely with the dentists in the area, making sure that we had dental records. We used police officers to pick up dental records, transport them to the medical examiner's office. I actually hand carried some dental records myself to the medical examiner's office. And then we wanted to make sure that we had counselors available not only for the families but for the first responders. And so I arranged with a team from the Oklahoma City bombing to come in, and they counseled police, fire, and people in the medical examiner's office.
And Lexington was able to reach out to the surrounding community.
Yes.
Other coroners and
Came
others
in
came
and helped,
from,
yes.
Yeah.
When we were doing accident reconstruction, some of our equipment actually malfunctioned in Jessamine County. Let us use some of their accident reconstruction equipment.
Deborah Hersman, who was with the NTSB at the time, who came here and spent so much time and really got to know people here, was very complimentary of Lexington's, the way it responded. What was it like being in that position that you were in, knowing, again, you're comforting those families, but knowing that an investigation had to get underway quickly into how this all happened?
We knew that the NTSB had to take the lead, and so we wanted to provide her with whatever resources that she needed. And we tried to do that with our law enforcement personnel, and so things were sort of running on two tracks. The investigation was going forward, and then we were trying to make sure that we were there for the families. And I can't say enough about the employees of the Campbell House, because so many families told me how kind and supportive the people in the restaurant were, the housekeeping people. Everyone really wrapped their arms around the families that were here.
And then, as you say, the two tracks, then there's a third, how to remember.
Right.
And so there was an event that was fairly quickly held for the families, and then you set about planning a public memorial.
We had a memorial just for the families at the Opera House, and we worked with hospice to plan that and to try to do what was most comforting to the families. And then we had a larger public memorial, and we actually worked with some people from Huntington to plan that had been involved with the Marshall University crash.
Were there people that you knew you could count on in this sort of situation, or were you, reaching out on that day and the days that followed to try to figure out where you could get assistance?
I called General Storm and General Arflack very early on to make sure we had the state resources, and the state provided us with everything we needed. Keeneland was very good to us. I can remember there was a house on the property, and that they opened that up to us to use sort of as a staging area and to hold meetings. The Campbell House made a conference room available to us, and so family members knew they could come and meet with us there. We had to get some interpreters in because some of the families involved were from other countries. So we were basically using every resource we had, and everyone was very cooperative and willing to help.
When you think back to those days, that awful tragedy, the most painful thing that certainly happened during your tenure as mayor, what do you think now, 10 years later?
It was very, very sad for our community. I think our community pulled together as well as any community could. We really wrapped our arms around the families. We tried to do an investigation as quickly as we could and get accurate facts so the NTSB could come out and make their public statements about it. And I think that the people of Lexington have been very respectful of the families and have tried to commemorate them. I see many people pay their respects at the memorial at the Arboretum, and we do want to remind people that it is a memorial, and so sometimes people forget and they want to actually sit on it or have a picnic on it, and so we want to remind people not to do that. And there is a new sign that's going to be going up to remind people not to do that.
And people have to go there and reflect in their own way,
Right,
don't they?
right. It's a very peaceful place that people can go and reflect.
Your tenure as mayor was bookended with major challenges, a major crippling ice storm just shortly after you took over as mayor, and then this crash late in your term. How do you keep your head in leading a major organization in a tragic time?
It's very important to remain calm, of course, and then to have very good organizational skills so that you know you have different tracks that have to be going on at the same time, and then to be able to communicate with different people in different ways. So, you know, you communicate with the families differently than you communicate with the media, and the media has always been very helpful in getting out information that we need, so the public is aware of what's going on, but you have to be able to organize and communicate, and to be truly concerned about the citizens that you represent, and you can't fake that. People know when you're sincere.
Is it comforting to you and maybe even to these families to know that at least there were some answers that came, there were some corrections that were made?
I hope that it was.
Yeah.
I know there were recommendations that were made, and I think all were implemented but one, and I think that is still out there. And that may be implemented later, but I think the families know that some corrections were made and that maybe no other families would have to suffer like they did.
The 10th anniversary was this weekend. Do you anticipate that there will be other major public memorials going forward through the years?
I have received a letter from the families saying that they wanted this to be the last public memorial, but that they would come and be there with their loved ones on their minds at the Arboretum and other places, but that they wanted this to be the last public memorial.
Teresa Isaac was the 5th mayor of the Lexington-Fayette Urban County Government, and we'll be back in just a moment. We'll talk about a couple of other things, see what you're up to these days when we finish up here on WKYT's Kentucky Newsmakers. Welcome back to WKYT's Kentucky Newsmakers. We visited with Debbie Hersman formerly of the NTSB a little bit earlier in our broadcast, and with former Lexington Mayor Teresa Isaac this morning as we've been talking about the 10th anniversary of the crash of Flight 5191 at Bluegrass Airport. Mayor Isaac, you were serving in office at that time. You left office later that year. What have you been up to in these years since?
Well, I've had some very interesting opportunities. I have taught a little. I have been able to train mayors around the world for the U.S. State Department. So I have been to Chile, Argentina, Namibia, Pakistan, Uganda, the West Bank, and so it's very interesting to connect with mayors around the world and see how they serve their people, and to talk to them about how you do react in a tragedy, how you do react if there's an ice storm or some weather-related event. And so it's interesting to get their perspective, and I learn as much from them as they learn from me. I still run the Fair Housing Office here, and so we do fair housing litigation statewide. We enforce the federal and state fair housing laws, and so it's kind of kept me in touch with what's going on around the state.
You've stayed busy.
I've stayed busy,
yeah.
And I'm a new grandma. I'm allowed to say that
you
now.
You sure can. Okay. Well, that's great. Congratulations.
Thank you.
You know, you always ran on it seemed, personal connections and this personal energy that almost made, I think, other political figures envious. You once told me that you were comfortable in every neighborhood, and I think you said that as part of your campaign when you ran. You were vice mayor and then mayor of Lexington. How do you think things in Lexington are going these days?
Well, I think you always have room for improvement. I think people want to make sure that they're heard, that they feel like that all of their interests are being taken care of, and that every neighborhood is being paid attention to. And so we have council members, obviously, that represent each district, and people know that they can go to those council members, and you want to make sure that you have opportunities for everybody, no matter what part of Lexington they're in.
Does social media make people more connected to
I
government?
think it does.
Yeah?
I think it does, because people will contact me now, and I still, Maureen, who was my administrative assistant, is Jim Gray's administrative assistant, so I'll still get requests that get funneled up through the chain. So people use social media to contact you, and that's another avenue for citizens to relate to their government.
You still call City Hall for people? to help?
Every now and then, yeah.
Your portrait now hangs in, in the City
yeah.
Hall down there. Features, you know, the smile that you're known for. Do you miss being mayor or being in that kind of position?
Well, you stay connected with the people that you help, and so I'm on the board of Emerge Kentucky, and we have candidates that run, and so you stay connected that way. You always want to serve the public in some capacity.
You ever consider a return to politics?
Oh, you never know. Opportunities can present themselves.
So you do keep a watch?
I do keep a watch.
What, as you right now are looking at the political scene, do you watch particular races?
I watch different races around the country, but I must say this presidential race is breaking every rule. There are no rules anymore, because you just think, golly, if somebody else said that would be the end of them. So it's been kind of fascinating to watch this presidential race and see how it seems there are no rules anymore.
Been an interesting year.
It has been an interesting year.
Listen, thanks for coming in. We appreciate it very much.
Absolutely.
All right, and Teresa Isaac, the former mayor of the Lexington-Fayette Urban County government. And we want to thank you for joining us for this edition of Kentucky Newsmakers on WKYT. Follow me at KY Newsmakers on Twitter. We'll keep you updated on politics and other happenings, and we'll see you bright and early this week on WKYT This Morning. We start at 4:30 a.m. You make it a good week ahead.